The morning sun spilled over the white sands of Zanzibar, turning the turquoise water into a sheet of glistening glass. Guests at the island's most exclusive resort lingered over breakfast, sipping fresh-pressed juice and talking in hushed voices. But that quiet hum was shattered when two uniformed officers stepped out of the lobby, escorting a tall, pale-skinned man in rumpled clothes, his wrists bound tightly in steel cuffs. His face was blotched red, eyes glassy, not from drink this time, but from whatever had unfolded behind closed doors hours earlier. The man was 37-year-old Ethan Blake, a Boston-based entrepreneur whose name was usually attached to luxury real estate deals, not international murder investigations. His wife, Vanessa Blake, wasn't trailing behind him. She wasn't anywhere, except in a body bag being loaded into the back of a police van parked discreetly near the resort's side entrance. Only hours before, Ethan and Vanessa had been just another wealthy American couple chasing paradise on this East African island. They'd checked into a sprawling oceanfront suite, the kind with private plunge pools and butlers on call. The trip, at least on paper, was meant to save their marriage. But here, in the powder-white sand and warm Indian Ocean breeze, something else entirely had taken root, something that would rip both of their lives apart before the sun had set again. Zanzibar sells itself as heaven. Postcard-perfect beaches, spice markets perfumed with clove and cinnamon, nights thick with music spilling from open-air bars. But there's a side of this island that never makes it into the brochures. Among locals and seasoned travelers, there's a term, beach boys culture. It's an unspoken but thriving undercurrent. Handsome, athletic local men offering attention, companionship, and more to foreign women passing through. It's flirtation with no strings attached. At least, that's the fantasy. Ethan had chosen Zanzibar, believing that the seclusion, beauty, and novelty could reset what had been broken for months. The last half year had been a carousel of arguments, about money, about work, about sex. Vanessa, 34, stunning with her golden hair and glowing tan, wanted more excitement, more freedom, more life. Ethan wanted loyalty, commitment, control. On their first night, they joined a resort's full moon beach party, a wild, pulsing celebration lit by fire dancers and strobe lights bouncing off the waves. Music thumped from massive speakers, liquor flowed without pause, and strangers became fast friends on the dance floor. Ethan drank heavily, laughing louder than he felt, trying to drown out the awkward silences that had been creeping into their marriage. By midnight, he was weaving toward the suite, mumbling about an early start for their snorkeling trip. Vanessa stayed behind. She was still on the beach when a group of 10 tall, dark-skinned men appeared, part tour guides, part entertainers, all of them radiating confidence. She laughed at something one of them whispered in her ear, another placed a drink in her hand. They danced close, the kind of dancing that ignored boundaries. Somewhere between one song and the next, the group drifted away from the crowd, and Vanessa went with them. What happened next wasn't supposed to leave that private villa on the far side of the resort. But the island has a way of keeping receipts. In the gray light before dawn, Ethan's phone buzzed on the nightstand. The text was from an unknown number. "This is your wife last night." There were pictures. There were videos. The kind of images you can't unsee. The kind you feel in your gut before your mind catches up. 10 men. His wife. Laughing, moving, touching like she'd never touched him in years. Within hours, Vanessa Blake would be dead, and the man once seen as her devoted husband would be sitting in a holding cell on foreign soil, staring at a future that no longer existed. What unfolded between that text message and the moment the police arrived is a story that would ignite headlines across 2 continents, spark furious debates about betrayal, sex, and violence. and leave one question hanging in the salty Zanzibar air. When love dies, how far will humiliation push a person? Ethan Blake had built a life that, from the outside, looked almost scripted for success. Born in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston, he'd clawed his way up from working summer construction jobs to running his own real estate investment firm by the time he was 30. His friends described him as a man who hated losing more than he loved winning, a competitor in business and in life. He dressed in sharp suits, drove a German sedan, and kept a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. But beneath the polished exterior was a man with a hair-trigger temper when it came to respect, or rather, the loss of it. Relationships had always been tricky for Ethan. He dated women who fit neatly into the image he wanted to project: beautiful, social, poised. But more than one ex had called him possessive, even controlling. He never hit anyone, but he had a way of making you feel cornered when you crossed him. Still, for years he managed to keep those darker impulses under wraps, burying them under success, charm, and the occasional grand romantic gesture. Then came Vanessa. She was impossible to ignore from the moment he met her at a charity gala in Miami. Vanessa Carmichael, 34, with sun-kissed skin, long blonde hair, and a body sculpted by years of Pilates and beachfront runs. She worked in PR for a luxury travel company, which meant her Instagram feed looked like a highlight reel of paradise. Champagne breakfasts, infinity pools, designer resort wear. She had a quick laugh, a sharper wit, and an appetite for adventure that drew people in. For Ethan, she was intoxicating, a mix of beauty and energy that made him feel younger, more alive. For Vanessa, Ethan represented stability, status, and a door into a world of privilege even her glamorous job couldn't fully provide. Within months, they were inseparable. 6 months later, they were married in a lavish vineyard ceremony in Napa, all soft lighting and expensive wine. At first, life together was intoxicating. They traveled constantly, St. Bart's in the winter, Lake Como in the summer. Ethan handled the bills, Vanessa curated the images. But cracks started to form early. She liked to stay out late, hopping between rooftop bars with her girlfriends, while Ethan preferred private dinners and early mornings at the gym. He bristled at the way other men looked at her, and she bristled at the way he always seemed to notice. There were arguments about money she spent without telling him, about text messages from male friends Ethan didn't know, about the growing distance between them in the bedroom. Ethan saw it as a lack of loyalty. Vanessa saw it as him choking the life out of their relationship. The tension peaked 6 months before Zanzibar. At a friend's wedding in Cabo, Ethan caught Vanessa dancing with a local guitarist well past midnight. When she finally came back to their suite, he confronted her, and she laughed it off. "You're being dramatic. It's just dancing." But for Ethan, it was a seed planted deep, a reminder that he couldn't control what she did when his eyes weren't on her. By the start of that summer, they were in a quiet war. Dinners together felt like business meetings. Touch was rare, and when it happened, it felt mechanical. They both knew something had to change. Ethan suggested counseling. Vanessa shrugged it off. "Maybe we just need to remember what it's like to have fun again," she said one night, twirling a glass of wine between her fingers. "Go somewhere far away. Somewhere beautiful." That's how Zanzibar came up. Vanessa had been there once for work, a press trip with travel journalists. She talked about the beaches, the spices, the night parties that went on until sunrise. Ethan, eager for a win, booked the trip without hesitation. First-class flights, the most expensive suite at one of the island's top resorts. He framed it as a romantic gesture, a reset button. Privately, though, he also saw it as a test. He believed that, away from the stress of their day-to-day lives, Vanessa would remember why she chose him. That she'd see they could be happy again if she'd just stopped chasing distractions. Vanessa's reaction to the trip was telling. She lit up at the idea of Zanzibar, but not for the reasons Ethan hoped. Her mind went to the parties, the energy, the new faces. She shopped for bikinis and dresses weeks in advance, posting countdown to paradise stories online, tagging her friends with palm tree emojis. She told Ethan she couldn't wait to walk barefoot on the beach with him at sunset, but she also told her friends she couldn't wait to let loose. In the days leading up to their departure, their interactions were a mix of polite civility and occasional sparks of the old chemistry. Ethan told himself this was the beginning of something better. Vanessa told herself she deserved to have fun, no matter what that looked like. By the time their flight touched down at Abeid Amani Karoum International Airport, Ethan was already calculating the ways he could make the week perfect. He'd planned private tours, romantic dinners, and even a surprise couples massage. He wanted to show her the man she married. Vanessa stepped off the plane into the humid, fragrant air of the island and thought about the stories she'd heard from other women in her industry. The whispered tales of Zanzibar's beach boys and the kind of attention that made you feel like the only woman in the world. She didn't plan to seek it out, but she didn't plan to avoid it either. Neither of them could have known it then, but the trip they hoped would save their marriage would become the setting for its violent, irreversible end. And all the unspoken resentments, all the quiet betrayals, were already packed in their luggage, ready to be unpacked under the hot African sun. From the moment they stepped into the lobby of the Zanzibar resort, it felt like they'd crossed into another world. The place looked like something out of a luxury travel magazine. Whitewashed walls with carved wooden doors, an open-air bar perfumed with fresh-cut limes and mint, and staff who greeted them with warm smiles and cool towels scented with clove. Outside, the Indian Ocean shimmered under a sun so bright it seemed almost theatrical. Ethan had chosen the suite at the far end of the property, a sprawling two-bedroom with a private plunge pool and an uninterrupted view of the horizon. "It's perfect," Vanessa said, trailing her fingers along the polished wood railing of the balcony. She wore oversized sunglasses, but Ethan caught the quick smirk that crossed her lips when she spotted a group of young, shirtless men unloading kayaks on the beach below. They spent the first afternoon in the way Ethan had imagined, lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails, letting the salt air loosen their shoulders. But as evening came, the energy of the island shifted. Drums echoed from somewhere down the beach. The resort's events coordinator stopped by with 2 wristbands and an irresistible smile. "Full Moon Beach Party, tonight at 9. Live music, dancers, fire shows, don't miss it." Ethan hadn't planned for a party. He'd imagined a quiet dinner and maybe a walk under the stars. But Vanessa's eyes lit up in a way he hadn't seen in months. "Come on," she coaxed. "Let's have some fun for once." The party was nothing like Ethan's usual scene. Massive speakers pounded a mix of Afro beats and dance hall, the bass thudding through the sand. Bonfires crackled, casting dancing shadows across the crowd. Women in flowing dresses spun barefoot in the surf, their hair wild in the breeze. And the men, local guides, dancers, beach vendors, moved through the crowd with an easy charm, offering drinks, jokes, and, if you stayed long enough, something more. Vanessa was in her element. She danced with strangers, her dress clinging to her from the humidity, her laughter sharp and bright over the music. Ethan tried to keep up, but after his 4th drink, the heat and the constant motion started to weigh on him. "I'm gonna head back," he told her, leaning in close. She nodded without looking at him, her eyes already back on the circle of dancers. By the time Ethan stumbled into their suite, the party's pulse was just a distant thump through the open balcony doors. He showered, lay down, and let the alcohol pull him into a heavy sleep. Vanessa, meanwhile, stayed on the beach long after the moon had risen high over the ocean. That's when she noticed them, the group of 10 men she'd seen earlier that afternoon. They weren't just dancers, they were the party. Tall, dark-skinned, their bodies moving like the music was part of them. One of them handed her a cold beer. Another leaned close, murmuring in her ear about an after-party at one of the resort's private villas. She hesitated, but not for long. The idea of slipping away, of doing something reckless, burned through her like a spark catching dry grass. She told herself it was harmless. Ethan was asleep, and she deserved to feel alive. The villa was even more lavish than her own suite. Candles flickered on the deck, bottles of liquor lined the counter, and the sound of the waves blended with bursts of laughter. What happened inside would later be described in whispered fragments by the few who knew, pieced together from shaky cell phone videos and blurred stills. But one thing was certain: Vanessa crossed a line that night, one there would be no coming back from. Outside, a security camera near the resort's garden path caught a single damning image. Vanessa, barefoot, dress slipping off one shoulder, walking hand in hand with two of the men, the rest trailing behind like a shadow. She didn't look back. When she finally returned to the suite, the first streaks of dawn were brushing the sky. Ethan was still asleep, his phone on the nightstand buzzing silently with an unread message from an unknown number. She slipped into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the water drown out the pounding of her heart. When he woke later that morning, a message from an unknown number waited on his phone. 3 videos and a string of images that would shatter everything between them. He wouldn't realize the full weight of what he'd seen until moments later, when Vanessa stepped out of the bathroom. He sat there, phone in one hand, the other clenched so tight his knuckles ached. He thought about every time he'd ignored a rumor, every time he told himself she was just being social. This wasn't dancing. This wasn't flirting. This was humiliation, broadcast in high definition. When Vanessa emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, Ethan was still sitting on the edge of the bed. He didn't say a word at first. She gave him a faint smile, like nothing was wrong, and started rifling through her suitcase for clothes. He finally spoke, his voice low but shaking. "Where were you last night?" Vanessa froze, then turned, her eyes narrowing. "I was out, having fun. You were passed out before midnight." He held up the phone. Her face didn't change. No shock, no denial. Just a shrug. "It was just fun, Ethan. You could never make me feel like that." The words hit him harder than any punch could have. In that moment, the week he'd planned, the future he'd imagined, they all collapsed into something jagged and ugly. He didn't feel the heat in his chest until his hands were already on her. What happened next would become the centerpiece of every headline, every court transcript, every whispered retelling. But in that sunlit room overlooking the turquoise sea, the only thing that mattered was that Ethan Blake had just crossed his own point of no return. The sun in Zanzibar has a way of making everything look softer in the morning, warm, gold-tinted, like the island is trying to apologize for the night before. But that morning, no amount of golden light could soften what was about to unfold in the Blakes' oceanfront suite. Ethan woke slowly, the way you do after too much alcohol, when your head feels like it's been packed with sand and your mouth tastes of stale liquor. For a few seconds, he didn't remember where he was. Then the sound of the waves beyond the balcony doors brought it back. Zanzibar, the trip that was supposed to fix everything. Vanessa. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, intending to check the time. Instead, he found a notification, an unread message from an unknown number. It was short, like it didn't need to say much. "This is your wife last night." There were attachments, 3 videos, a dozen still images. His thumb hesitated over the first file, a part of him already knowing that whatever was in there would change everything. He pressed play. The first clip was shaky, like it had been recorded on someone's phone in a dimly lit room. It showed Vanessa from behind, her hair loose and damp, moving to music that was faint under the sound of voices. Two men flanked her, their hands on her waist. She turned toward the camera for a moment, smiling wide, and Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The second video stripped away any room for doubt. Vanessa was on a couch, her dress pushed up, surrounded by bodies, dark-skinned, muscular men whose faces were half in shadow. There was no mistaking what was happening. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even intimate. It was raw, unfiltered, and so far removed from the woman Ethan thought he knew that he almost didn't believe it was her. The third video was worse. He didn't watch all of it. The sound alone, her laugh, the deep voices around her, the way she called one of them by name, was enough to make his chest ache like it was splitting open. By the time he set the phone down, his hands were trembling. His breathing had gone shallow. He felt heat rising under his skin, a burn that started in his chest and spread outward until his ears rang. He stared at the floor, replaying every small fight, every cold shoulder. Every night she'd come home smelling faintly of someone else's cologne. Through the haze, he noticed the other half of the bed was empty. The bathroom door was closed, the sound of running water spilling into the room. Vanessa was in there, humming faintly to herself over the noise of the shower. Ethan sat there for a long time, phone still in his hand, the screen dark now. He thought about waking her with the images right in her face, about demanding an explanation, about the look she'd give him when she realized she'd been caught. But another thought pushed its way in, one he didn't want to admit even to himself. Well, she didn't care. The bathroom door opened, and steam rolled out into the suite. Vanessa stepped out in a towel, her skin glowing from the heat, her hair wrapped up. She didn't look startled to see him awake. If anything, she looked slightly annoyed, like she'd been interrupted. "You're up early," she said, moving toward her suitcase. "Where were you last night?" His voice was low, measured, but his hands were still clenched on his thighs. She glanced over her shoulder. "I told you I stayed at the party. You passed out before midnight. You didn't miss much. I missed enough." He picked up the phone from the bed and turned the screen toward her. The image was frozen on one of the videos, her mid-laugh, with a man's hand gripping her thigh. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to him. No gasp, no denial. Just a small shrug. "It was just fun, Ethan. You could never make me feel like that." The words hit harder than the videos. They landed with a finality that told him there would be no apology, no shame, no reason given that would make any of it better. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the waves outside and the faint hum of the air conditioner. Ethan could feel the blood rushing in his ears, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He had come here believing they could save this. Now, he couldn't imagine looking at her without seeing those videos burned into the back of his mind. Vanessa turned away first, rifling through her suitcase for clothes. "We should just enjoy the rest of the trip," she said, as if the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. "No point in making it worse than it is." Ethan stood up slowly, the phone slipping from his hand onto the bed. "Worse than it is?" His voice cracked, and she paused for just a second before going back to her search. He crossed the room in 3 steps. She looked up, startled this time, as his hand closed around her arm. "You humiliated me," he said, his voice shaking now not from alcohol or exhaustion, but from something darker, something boiling over. "In front of strangers. In front of the whole damn world if they wanted to see it." She yanked her arm back, eyes flashing. "You take everything so seriously. God, Ethan, you're pathetic when you're jealous." That was it. The match to the powder. He didn't think about what he was doing, didn't think about the room, the trip, the laws of a country that wasn't his. His hands moved on their own, up to her neck, fingers pressing hard against the soft skin there. She gasped, clawed at his wrists, but he held on. Her eyes went wide, then glassy, her legs kicking once against the bed frame. He could feel her pulse under his thumbs, fast and frantic, then slowing. When he finally let go, she crumpled to the floor, the towel still clutched around her, her hair damp against her cheek. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, staring at the woman he had married, and the body she had become in the space of a single morning. Somewhere far off, a gull cried over the surf. The sun kept climbing over the water. The world, uncaring, moved on. The silence in the room pressed down on him, each second making the burn in his chest more dangerous. By the time she reached for her suitcase, words were already forming, sharp, ugly, and they were coming out whether he. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, phone in hand. The videos were still open, the frozen frame of her smiling in the middle of that room, surrounded by men glaring up at him from the screen. His voice was low when he spoke. "Where were you last night?" She didn't look up. "I told you I stayed at the party. You stayed with them." His tone was flat, but his chest was tight. That made her pause for just a heartbeat, but then she smirked faintly. "You mean the guys?" "Yeah, it was fun. Something you clearly wouldn't understand." It was the same kind of jab she'd thrown at him before in arguments back home. Usually he could walk away. This time, the words burrowed under his skin like barbed wire. "Fun?" he asked, his voice rising. "You let 10 strangers." He stopped himself, the words choking off as the image replayed again in his head. She turned then, facing him fully, her eyes sharp. "You could never make me feel like that, Ethan. Never. So maybe instead of sulking, you should ask yourself why." Something inside him broke in that instant. The videos had humiliated him. Her tone, her lack of remorse, was gasoline on the fire. But it was those last words, the way she drove the blade in and twisted, that sent the heat from his chest to his hands. He stood up, closing the space between them in 3 steps. Vanessa tried to sidestep, but he caught her wrist and spun her back toward him. The towel she'd been holding slipped slightly, revealing damp skin. "Don't you walk away from me," he hissed. "Or what?" She shot back, pulling against his grip. "You'll do what you always do? Sulk? Pout? Pretend you're the victim? God, you're pathetic." The word echoed in his head like a hammer strike. Pathetic. His hand moved her throat almost without thought. The contact was electric, shocking even to him for half a second. And then it wasn't shocking at all. It was inevitable. She gasped, her hands flying up to claw at his wrists, but he held firm. His thumbs pressed against the hollow of her throat, feeling the rapid drum of her pulse. She was trying to speak. He could feel the vibrations against his fingers, but the words didn't matter anymore. All he could see was the smurf from the bathroom door, the laugh in those videos, the image of her with men's hands all over her like she was theirs to claim. His vision narrowed, red bleeding into the edges. Vanessa's nails raked across his skin, but his grip didn't loosen. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face as her kicks slowed. There was a single moment where she stopped fighting and just stared at him, like she finally realized he wasn't going to let go. When her body went slack, the sound of the waves outside crashed back into his awareness. He let her go, and she crumpled to the floor, the towel tangled around her legs. Ethan stumbled back a step, his chest heaving, every breath like it was being dragged through glass. He didn't kneel to check her pulse. Some part of him already knew there was no coming back from what he'd just done. Not for her, not for him. He turned away, pressing his palms into his eyes, trying to force the image of her face in those last seconds out of his mind. But the images from the videos came back instead, sharper than before. The room felt too quiet now, the kind of quiet that buzzed in your ears. He picked up his phone from the bed, the message thread still open. The unknown number sat there, as if waiting for him to reply. He thought about deleting everything, but the idea felt pointless. This was bigger than a few files on a screen. Through the balcony doors, he saw a couple walking hand in hand along the shore, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. It was obscene, almost insulting, that the world was still moving, that people could still smile, when it had just imploded in a 10-minute storm of rage. Ethan moved to the bathroom sink and splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and there were faint red marks on his neck where Vanessa had tried to scratch her way free. He looked like someone he didn't recognize, and yet, deep down, like someone who'd been there all along, just waiting for the right fracture to appear. He didn't hear the knock at first. It was soft, polite, then louder. A voice calling from the hallway. Housekeeping. He glanced at Vanessa's body, still crumpled near the bed, and felt his throat tighten. The knock came again, followed by the rattle of a key card in the lock. And in that split second, Ethan understood something clearly. Whatever story got told from here on out, he wasn't going to be the one in control of it. The door swung open, and the smiling young housekeeper's expression collapsed the instant she stepped inside. Her eyes flicked from Ethan, standing rigid near the bathroom, to the lifeless figure on the floor. The towel around Vanessa's body had loosened, one arm sprawled out in an unnatural angle. The housekeeper froze for half a second, then bolted back into the hall, shouting in rapid Swahili. Ethan didn't move. He could hear the pounding of footsteps, the rise in voices outside, but his feet felt anchored to the tile. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security guards from the resort appeared in the doorway. Their faces tightened as they took in the scene. One of them stepped inside cautiously, speaking in English with a heavy accent. "Sir, please step away." Ethan raised his hand slowly, as if in a trance, and backed toward the bed. The guard knelt to check Vanessa's pulse, his expression confirming what Ethan already knew. The other guard was on his radio, speaking urgently. By the time the local police arrived, the hallway outside the suite had turned into a wall of whispers and curious faces, guests craning their necks, resort staff murmuring to one another. The officers pushed them back, stepping inside with measured, deliberate movements. They were dressed in khaki uniforms, caps pulled low against the sun. One carried a small camera, the other a leather-bound notebook. "Mr. Blake," the older of the two began, "we need you to tell us what happened here." Ethan's voice came out flat. "We had an argument." She fell. The officer's eyes swept the room, lingering on the marks around Vanessa's neck, the overturned chair near the desk, and the scattered contents of her suitcase. "Fell," he repeated, as though tasting the word. They separated Ethan from the body, seating him on the couch while crime scene technicians began their slow, methodical work. Photographs of the suite, close-ups of Vanessa's injuries, the towel, the faint red marks on Ethan's wrists and forearms where she'd scratched him. One officer noticed the phone lying on the bed, still open to the message thread from that morning. "We will need this," he said, slipping it into an evidence bag. Ethan didn't protest. The body was photographed, examined, and finally covered before being taken out on a stretcher through the service elevator to avoid the crowd that had gathered in the lobby. Still, word spread fast. By midday, half the resort knew that the American couple in the oceanfront suite were no longer on vacation together. At the police station in Stone Town, the air was heavy with humidity and the smell of diesel drifting in from the street. Ethan sat in a metal chair in a windowless room, the only light coming from a flickering fluorescent overhead. Across from him sat Detective Salim Bakery, a tall man in his 40s with deep-set eyes and a voice like gravel. "Tell me again," Bakery said, "about the argument." Ethan kept his answer short, sticking to the same story. They argued. She tripped. She fell. But Bakery's gaze was steady, unblinking. Your wife has bruising consistent with manual strangulation, and there are scratches on your neck. These are not from a fall. Ethan swallowed, but said nothing. The detective slid a printed photo across the table. It was a still from a security camera in the resort garden path. Vanessa, barefoot, walking hand in hand with two of the men from the beach party, the others trailing behind. The timestamp was 2:13 a.m. You knew about this? Bakery asked. Ethan looked at the picture for a long moment. I saw the videos this morning. From who? Anonymous number. I don't know. Bakery leaned back in his chair. This island is small, Mr. Blake. People see things. People talk. You came here to fix your marriage, but something happened last night that made you very angry. Angry enough to put your hands around her neck. The questioning went on for hours. They asked about their marriage, about previous fights, about Ethan's drinking. They showed him the scratches on his arms, the impressions on his palms from where his hands had clenched. Each time, Ethan tried to stick to the same version of events, but each time it sounded thinner, less believable, even to him. By late afternoon, the decision came down. Ethan Blake was under arrest for the suspected murder of Vanessa Blake. They let him make one phone call to the U.S. consulate. His voice was low, almost monotone, as he explained to the duty officer what had happened. They told him a representative would visit the next day, but until then, he'd be in local custody. Back at the resort, detectives continued gathering statements. Several guests from the beach party confirmed seeing Vanessa with a group of local men. One said they saw her leave the dance area with them. Another claimed she seemed very intoxicated but happy. The security footage showed Ethan returning alone to the suite just after midnight, and Vanessa coming back hours later, barefoot, clothes slightly askew. There was no footage of what happened inside the room, but the timeline was clear enough for the police. She returned in the early morning, and by mid-morning she was dead. The next day's headlines in Zanzibar's English-language paper were blunt. American tourist held Iron wife's death at luxury resort. By the following week, the story had made its way into the U.S. media, splashed across cable news tickers and crime blogs. In Stone Town, Ethan sat on the edge of the narrow cot in his holding cell, listening to the sounds of the street outside, the calls of vendors, the distant hum of a motorbike. He knew that somewhere, in some evidence locker, his phone was sitting with those videos still on it. And he knew that, no matter what happened next, the rest of the world would see him not as a husband on vacation, but as a man who'd crossed the one line you can never uncross. The trial of Ethan Blake was never going to be small. From the moment his arrest hit U.S. headlines, the case had all the ingredients to dominate the news cycle for months. An American businessman, a luxury resort in an exotic location, a beautiful wife, and a scandal so salacious it could ruin reputations on 2 continents. By the time his first pretrial hearing was scheduled in Zanzibar's High Court, the media swarm was already in place. On the morning the trial began, the street outside the courthouse was lined with reporters, photographers, and camera crews from as far away as London and New York. Tanzanian police set up barricades to keep the growing crowd at bay. Vendors sold bottled water and roasted peanuts to curious locals who'd come to catch a glimpse of the American who killed his wife. Ethan arrived in a dark SUV flanked by 2 armed officers. His once carefully groomed appearance had been replaced by a plain white shirt and loose trousers, his hair longer and streaked with gray. He kept his head down as the press shouted questions. Ethan, do you regret it? Did you kill her in cold blood? Was it really because of the videos? Inside the courtroom, the air was thick and hot despite the open windows. Ceiling fans hummed lazily overhead, stirring the scent of old wood and dust. The gallery was packed with journalists, diplomats, and a scattering of locals who'd managed to get seats. On one side sat the prosecution team, 3 Tanzanian lawyers led by State Attorney Joseph Nyerere. a man known for his sharp cross-examinations. On the other side, Ethan's defense team, headed by a well-dressed Kenyan attorney named Patrick Mwandu, hired with funds from Ethan's family back in Boston. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their theory. This was not an accident, not a spur-of-the-moment push that went wrong. It was deliberate, a crime of rage rooted in humiliation, triggered by the knowledge and the graphic proof that his wife had been sexually involved with multiple men during their vacation. They began with the evidence. The security camera still showing Vanessa walking barefoot with two of the men from the party, the timestamp burned into the corner. Then came the testimony from the resort security manager, who described finding Ethan calm but distant in the room, his wife's body on the floor. When the prosecutor queued up the videos sent to Ethan's phone, the room shifted. The judge cleared the gallery of non-press spectators, ruling that the explicit material would not be shown to the public, only to the jury and attorneys. But descriptions of the content were entered into the record, and even without seeing them, the reporters in the room scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The most damaging testimony came from the forensic pathologist. In precise, clinical terms, she described the injuries to Vanessa's neck, bruising patterns consistent with manual strangulation, damage to the cartilage in her throat, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. These injuries, she said, could not have been caused by a fall. The defense countered with a different narrative. Yes, Ethan and Vanessa had argued. Yes, she had been with other men the night before. But Patrick Mwandu painted his client as a man blindsided by betrayal, who lost control in a moment of emotional devastation. He invoked the concept of crime of passion, arguing that Ethan had no history of violence toward his wife and that the killing lacked premeditation. They brought in character witnesses, old friends from Boston, business associates, who described Ethan as a man of integrity, a loving husband who had gone to great lengths to save his marriage. They also highlighted Vanessa's lifestyle, her late nights, her social media posts, and the rumors that had circulated about her fidelity. The implication was clear. She had provoked him. The prosecution bristled at this tactic, calling it victim blaming. In one tense exchange, Attorney Nyarir leaned over the podium and said, "Mr. Blake's wife could have made any choices she wanted in her private life. That is not given the right to take her life. This is not Boston. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is murder." State Attorney Nyarir's voice cut through the heat-heavy air. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about what she did the night before. It is about what he did the next morning. You saw the photos. You heard the expert. You know the pressure it takes to crush the life out of someone. That is not a momentary lapse. It is a choice. And choices have consequences." International reaction to the trial was immediate and polarized. American talk shows debated the case endlessly. Some commentators condemned Ethan outright, pointing out that betrayal, no matter how extreme, cannot justify killing someone. Others, particularly on certain radio call-in shows, expressed a surprising level of sympathy. "You can only push a man so far," one caller said. "I'm not saying it's right, but I understand it." In Tanzania, public sentiment was more uniform. Most locals saw Ethan as an outsider who had brought shame to their country's reputation as a safe, welcoming tourist destination. Editorials in the national papers called for a stiff sentence, warning that letting him off lightly would send a message that wealthy foreigners could commit violence without consequence. Midway through the trial, the anonymous source of the videos came under scrutiny. The prosecution hinted that at least one of the men in the footage had sent them directly to Ethan, possibly to provoke a confrontation. But they never established a clear link, and the judge ruled that it had no bearing on whether Ethan's actions were criminal. The emotional climax came when Vanessa's younger sister, Mariah, took the stand. She spoke through tears about their last phone call, days before the killing. She told me they were fighting again, Mariah said. But she also said she thought this trip might be a turning point. She didn't know it would be the end. The defense cross-examined gently, aware that attacking a grieving family member would only alienate the jury. Still, the image of Vanessa's sister breaking down on the stand left an undeniable mark on the proceedings. When it came time for Ethan to testify, his attorneys were divided on the strategy. In the end, he took the stand. His voice was steady at first as he described their marriage, the arguments, and the mourning of Vanessa's death. But when he reached the moment he put his hands on her neck, his composure cracked. "I wasn't thinking," he said, tears slipping down his face. "It was like something snapped in me. I just wanted her to stop laughing at me, to stop humiliating me. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear to God, I didn't mean it." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. "You didn't mean to kill her," Nyrier said, "but you squeezed her neck until the life left her body. How many seconds does that take, Mr. Blake? How many times could you have let go before she stopped breathing?" Ethan had no answer. After closing arguments, the judge gave the jury their instructions. They could convict on first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. The deliberations lasted 2 days. When a verdict came back, the courtroom was silent except for the hum of the fans. Guilty of second-degree murder. Ethan's shoulders sagged as the words were read aloud. The sentence, 25 years in a Tanzanian prison, would come a week later. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and jeers. Vanessa's family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Ethan was led back to the waiting SUV, his hands cuffed, his eyes fixed on the ground. The trial may have ended, but the conversation it sparked was far from over. On social media, hashtags like hashtag Justice for Vanessa and hashtag Crime of Passion trended for days. Talk shows dissected every angle: marital betrayal, male pride, the thin line between rage and control. Some saw it as a cautionary tale about jealousy. Others saw it as proof that certain cultural attitudes toward infidelity and masculinity can turn lethal. In the end, the image that stuck with the public wasn't the security camera still or the grainy videos. It was the shot of Ethan being driven away from the courthouse, the turquoise waters of Zanzibar just visible in the distance. A paradise turned prison for both of them. When the judge finally returned to the bench to deliver Ethan Blake's sentence, the air inside the Zanzibar High Court was so still it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The trial had dragged on for weeks, every headline and whispered detail keeping both the local and international press glued to their seats. Now it came down to this moment. Ethan stood as the interpreter read the verdict and sentence aloud in English. 25 years in a Tanzanian maximum security prison. No possibility of parole until at least 2 decades had passed. For a man who had built his life around control, freedom, and status, the words landed like a slow, heavy collapse. He didn't cry. He didn't protest. He only lowered his head slightly, jaw tight, as if absorbing a blow he'd known was coming. Behind him, a murmur ran through the gallery, some voices satisfied, others whispering that it wasn't enough. Vanessa's family, seated in the front row, clutched each other's hands. Her sister Mariah wept openly, while their mother stared straight ahead, her face carved in stone. Later, she told reporters, "No sentence will bring Vanessa back. But at least now, he can't hurt anyone else." Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Locals shouting for justice, tourists lingering to snap photos, and reporters shoving microphones toward anyone with an opinion. Tanzanian authorities made a point of parading Ethan through the crowd on his way to the transport van, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression unreadable. Prison in Tanzania was a world away from the life Ethan had known. He was sent to Ukanga prison on the mainland, a sprawling, overcrowded facility where cells meant for 8 men often held twice that number. The walls were peeling, the air thick with heat and the scent of sweat and disinfectant. The first days were the hardest. Ethan had to adjust to a place where there were no private showers, no soft beds, and no one cared who he had been in Boston. Inmates called him Mzungu, the Swahili word for white man, and while some were curious about his case, others saw him as an outsider to be tested. He kept to himself, learning quickly that eye contact could be an invitation for trouble. The U.S. consulate visited within the first month, but they could do little beyond ensuring he had access to legal counsel and occasional letters from his family. His parents wrote once, promising to stand by him, but the gap between their words and the reality of his isolation was immeasurable. Back in the States, the fallout from the case continued. Ethan's business holdings unraveled in his absence. Partners distancing themselves, clients pulling out, properties sold off to cover mounting legal bills. Friends who had once admired his drive and success now avoided his name in conversation. In the court of public opinion, he was no longer a savvy entrepreneur. He was the man who killed his wife over a vacation fling. For Vanessa's family, the sentence marked both an end and a beginning. They flew home with her ashes, holding a small memorial service in Miami. Photos from her life, childhood beach trips, college graduation, wedding day, were arranged on a table surrounded by candles. Friends and relatives shared memories that painted a complicated picture. A woman who was vibrant and flawed, who could light up a room but also push people away. The resort in Zanzibar where it all happened faced its own reckoning. Bookings dipped sharply in the months after the killing, and management quietly phased out the wild full moon beach parties that had been a staple of their marketing. The villa where the videos were allegedly filmed was shuttered for renovations, though staff said it remained untouched, frozen in time like a room no one wanted to enter. On social media, the debate didn't die down. The hashtags shifted from hashtag Justice for Vanessa to hashtag Lessons from Zanzibar, and online arguments raged over loyalty, betrayal, and the fine line between passion and violence. Some called Ethan a cold-blooded murderer. Others insisted that anyone in his shoes would have snapped. The polarization only seemed to grow as true crime podcasts picked up the story, each framing it in their own way. Some sympathetic, others merciless. In prison, Ethan kept a low profile. He worked in the prison library, sorting worn paperbacks and old newspapers. Sometimes late at night, he would replay those hours in the suite over and over, the videos, the confrontation, the moment his hands closed around her neck. He claimed, even to himself, that he hadn't meant to kill her, but he could never quite explain why he hadn't let go. By his second year inside, the letters from home came less frequently. His parents' health was failing. The life he had once built, brick by brick, was now a collapsed ruin, and he had no tools left to rebuild. For Vanessa's family, the years did not dull the loss. Birthdays, holidays, even random Tuesdays carried her absence like a shadow. But they clung to the fact that her story, however tragic, had made an impact, that somewhere someone might think twice before letting pride, jealousy, or rage take control. And for the people of Zanzibar, the story became a cautionary tale, told in whispers to tourists, folded into the island's folklore about what happens when paradise turns dark. The sea still glittered under the morning sun. The beach parties still played their music. But somewhere, just beneath the surface, lingered the memory of a marriage that came here to heal and left in handcuffs and ashes.